When we talk about the regional implications, obviously the region this year is going through extraordinary changes throughout the Middle East. And the changes have come about because of what has often been described as having existed over the last 40 years in many Arab countries as having been a period of stagnation. Of stagnation, not that things were dramatically deteriorating, they just weren't getting better and nothing was changing. If the term stagnation applies to the Arab world until the last few months, then perhaps stagnation is also a word that can be described to the Israeli-Palestinian relationship, at least in the recent past, in the last few years. After periods of very intense negotiations, when many thought the prospects for change were positively dramatic, the last few years have seen the opposite. It has been said that some time ago, an Israeli and a Palestinian went to see God, and they said, "We are an Israeli and a Palestinian. We've come to ask you whether there will ever be peace between our two peoples." And God said, "Yes, of course there will. There's no doubt about it, but it won't be in my time." Well, I don't know whether that was a comment which will prove to be true, but what we are interested in this session is looking at whether the possibility of a unilateral declaration of statehood endorsed by the United Nations, what the impact will be on negotiations, on the prospect for a two-state solution, and of the regional dimension. And to help guide us in these discussions, we have Elliot Abrams, Nabil Sharaf, and also joining us now is Erin Lerman. That's a change in your original program. Erin Lerman is the Deputy National Security Advisor of Israel for Foreign Policy and highly qualified to add to the discussions we're having today. So I will start by inviting Elliot to make his presentation and then work my way down the table.
I should begin, I think, by saying this comes at a moment, of course, of introspection in the Arab world. While these events are happening between Israelis and Palestinians, much more unexpected and historic events are happening in several important Arab countries. My fear is that what we may see in some of the newly free political systems, and Egypt is probably the one would have to worry about most because it is right there and is the most populous Arab country, is a form of crude populism. It would not be all that surprising to see politicians newly freed up seeking votes through cheap crowd pleasers. This is especially true, I think, if it turns out that the economy is in bad shape in Egypt. And that, I think we would all have to say, is unfortunately a reasonably likely occurrence. There are 85 million mouths to feed. Tourism, foreign investment are in pretty bad shape. Those people who I think are most associated with the opening to the free market, such as it was under President Mubarak, are now in very bad odor in Cairo. Some are in prison, some are under arrest or under indictment. And there is, I think, a fear that the elements of positive economic policy will be tossed out. So I worry a good deal about that, about politicians who are seeing their appeal not going over, turning to something that they think may work better, which is just a kind of rabble-rousing on the Israeli-Palestinian question. I don't worry so much about actual conflict. I think we've seen in Sinai the efforts of the Israeli and Egyptian authorities to avoid an escalation of emotions, but it is going to present a problem for both sides. You have in Sinai now an area that is decreasingly under the control of the government in Cairo, I think. And as terrorist groups, Hamas, others that claim to be linked to al-Qaeda, use Sinai to attack Israel, you run the risk that Israel and Egypt will not get into conflict, in my view, but will get into tougher diplomatic situation. I do not also see any real risk of conflict between Israel and Turkey. The rhetoric that's been emerging from Ankara in the last week in particular is pretty disgusting. But that doesn't mean that they're foolish enough to engage in any kind of direct confrontation, particularly at a time when the government in question has so demoralized its own military, which has certainly happened in Turkey. So I worry less about that. I do think we have to ask about what's the immediate impact for Palestinians of a declaration of statehood passing in some form in New York. There are a lot of questions Palestinians will have to answer. They could claim certain rights as a state and attempt to enforce those rights against Israel and Israeli forces in the West Bank. That would immediately create a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. The Palestinian government could, though it has said repeatedly it is completely opposed to the use of violence, it could call for mass demonstrations. Those mass demonstrations strike me as quite dangerous. Any mass demonstration anywhere can get out of hand, even in the best of times. These are not the best of times. And we know there are plenty of people who would be happy to use such an opportunity to create violence. Hamas, obviously, and other Palestinian extremist groups could easily infiltrate people into such a demonstration in an effort to create violence and chaos. That, I would say, worries me a good deal. Going to New York, as the PA and PLO continue to insist they're doing, also runs the risk, I think, of raising the expectations of the Palestinian people in a way that is not going to be met, at least in the short run. If something passes in New York on September 20th or 25th or October 1st, Palestinian life in the West Bank is not going to change the following day. And if people are expecting a change, the frustration will grow, and then we feed again into the question of demonstrations and violence. Palestinian-Israeli and potentially Palestinian-Israeli relations and relations between Israel and potentially other Arab states could also be affected by what we now call lawfare. If, for example, the Palestinians decide to try using the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, which they have been unable to use because the ICC has said PLO has no standing, if they attempt to use it after a UN vote against Israeli officials, that will simply embitter Israeli-Palestinian relations. If Arab states get behind such an effort, that could hurt the limited relations that Israel now has with Arab states, and again, one has to worry most about Egypt, but secondarily about Jordan, where the government, well, in both cases, the government very concerned about public opinion now and probably unwilling to take what I would view as a responsible position that goes against an inflamed public opinion. So I guess in the interest of time, I will stop. What I think we see here is the possibility of a very negative regional impact from the events in New York. But it is a possibility, and it depends to a very real degree on decisions, I think, that the Palestinian leadership makes, and at least in the case of Egypt, what the politicians who are now running for office, not least the office of president there, make about how to fit these events into their domestic politics. And if they decide that this is a good political issue, that political capital can be made from this issue, then I think we are in for a few months of real turmoil. Thank you.
You know, Mr. Obama's speech started with the May speech, started with 4 risks that Israel has, really upon which he advised Israel to go into a peace process with the Palestinians. And I think it's relevant just to quote them now. One is the Palestinian demography, i.e. the Palestinians, as he said, west of the Jordan River are growing demographically, and they've become a much more important factor in the situation that Israel has to take care of. Watch, worry, if you wish. But that's what the Israelis call the Palestinian demographic bomb. It's not a bomb. It's a very human sort of reality. Number 2, the Arab Spring. President Obama felt that the Arab Spring will change the power relationships in the area that Israel has to really watch and prepare for by creating better relations with the Arabs. 3, changing technology that makes defensible borders a matter of past history, that it's not a question of how far are you from the next gunman. It's a world of rocketry and satellites and so on. So the question of defensible border become really have a totally different meaning. And thirdly, and fourthly, the impatience of the international community about the pace Israel is taking in seeking a peace process. The world is getting more impatient with Israel, Mr. Obama said. I may be paraphrasing his words, but go back, Google it, and you find these are the 4 major things that, from Mr. Obama's point of view, impels Israel and the Palestinians to go to find a solution. The 4th one is particularly important in the concept we are talking about in this session, and that is the impact of regional impatience. The Arab Spring is going to create changes. I'm sure the Egyptians are not going to use that spring to cancel their agreement with Israel and to go into war with Israel. I don't think this is the option of any of the forces forming today in Egypt. But all Egyptians want their government to be more tough in dealing with Israeli violations of the Camp David agreement that has been signed by Egypt and Israel in 1979. That Egypt should be tougher when there is an aggression against Gaza. That Egypt should be more supportive of the people of Gaza and protective of them from the very harsh siege that Israel imposes on them. And Turkey is the same. Without a spring, that's precisely what Turkey is doing. Turkey tried to break the illegal siege imposed by Israel on the people of Gaza and sent unarmed citizens with food and support for Gaza. And 9 of them were killed last year in the flotilla. And that is still the problem that Turkey is downgrading its relationship with Israel about. And so I think the region is not really, the changes in the regions are not going to lead to war between regional powers, particularly Egypt and Turkey in this case, and Israel. But Israel will have to account. It cannot really act as unaccountable as it has been from the region and from the international community. And that's precisely why we are going to the United Nations. Again, I do not like UDI as the name of this conference. It is not, we are not going to declare anything. We have declared it in 1988. What we are doing is seeking more recognitions of that declaration that we made in 1988. It used to be 84, it's now 126, moving. And we are seeking membership of the United Nations. It's not like suddenly we're declaring a state in Palestine under occupation. No, that state is a body that has been created in 1988. And the Palestinian organizational entity that declared it is the Palestine Liberation Organization, which still exists and is still led by our President Abu Mazen, President Mahmoud Abbas. And therefore, seeking this recognition increases the bonds between us and our Arab brothers and Turkish cousins, if you wish, important regional players in the area, but also appeals to the international community for greater support. There are not going to be major surprises. And Israel is alarmed because that might make us members of the International Criminal Court. We are not going to the International Criminal Court to harass Israel. We are going to the International Court to protect ourselves from potential crimes that the Israelis will make against our people in Gaza and somewhere else. We want this international strength, this support from the international community to help us break through the barriers that the Israeli government is creating to make it impossible for us to go to real negotiations and make a real peace process between us based on some equality. Roger Cohen, a very important editor at the New York Times, just a few weeks ago, said that the whole problem of negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis is the total lack of equality between them. There is imparity in their powers. And that really encourages the Israeli to use that imparity to its favor to make it impossible for the Palestinians to reach any agreement with it. And Roger Cohen says, what brought the Palestinians to the negotiations in 1990, 1991 was the guarantees and promises of the United States that it will try to reduce the imparity between you and the Israelis in the negotiating table by being there, by being present, by guarding the terms of reference, by pushing people to come to an agreement. And now that the United States is not playing that role, it's very difficult to see how an agreement can be made. Professor Shifton, who was here, had predicted that. He said that the whole Israeli-Palestinian peace is irrelevant to the area, it does not count, and the Americans cannot really do anything to make it work, and the Palestinians are not ready to deliver anything, and therefore there is no use to reach an agreement, and if we reach an agreement, it won't lead to anything, and therefore forget an agreement. Forget an agreement, but remain in occupation. Not only remain in occupation, but deepen it. That is, if you go to the guarantees that Mr. Baker, they didn't call them guarantees, assurances, that Mr. Baker gave us during the Bush the father administration. These assurances were about settlements, were about Jerusalem, were about our rights. Refugees was one of the very important items of every negotiations we made with Israel. I led the Palestinian team on negotiation with refugees in Camp David and in Taba and other places. It was never ignored by Israel or by the Palestinians. It was one of the 6 issues that needed to be settled. It's not a crime to ask for our rights. But we are ready to negotiate, to reach a modality that makes it possible for us to have a win-win end. And I think it is possible, and it was possible. It was possible with Mr. Begin, but the Palestinian part of the agreement between Egypt was then negotiated between Egypt and the Israelis and never really reached anywhere because of the Israeli policy. Mr. Rabin was ready to conclude the peace, but he was assassinated by an Israeli, not by a Palestinian. And Mr. Olmert was ready to go into an agreement, but before we reached it, he was drowning with accusation of corruption and had to leave the government and would not really continue. So let us not mislead the facts. We are going into an international era not to harass Israel, but to try to create a little bit of balance so that on the negotiating table, it is not somebody who orders and the other have to obey. It's not an occupier and an occupied. Why does not Israel even withdraw, as the Oslo Agreement requires, from everywhere in the West Bank and Gaza, the exception of Jerusalem and the settlements? This is what they should have done. And negotiate state to state, so that we can reach an agreement with some balance, with some lack of imparity of the balance of power. If our international attempt gives us better support from our neighbors, gives us better support from the United Nations institutions, give us better political support from Europe, and hopefully, when Mr. Obama is re-elected, and I really do hope he will be re-elected, that in his second term he will be freer, like Mr. Clinton was in his second term, like Mr. Bush was in his second term. A second term always allows a president to give more time to international affairs. The domestic concerns are number one in his first term. Today, the problem is not the Jewish lobby in the United States. The problem is the right-wing lobby. That is the one that is making it very difficult for Mr. Obama to go anywhere. I don't accept that always blame everything on the Jewish lobby. That is not the case. The problem Mr. Obama faces is with his own right wing, with his Tea Party, which is making it very difficult for him to give us the kind of support Mr. Roger Cohen talks about in his article. Now there is an Israeli Spring. And so the region includes Israel today. There is an Israeli Spring. 430,000 demonstrators last Saturday. And their social demands immediately turn into political demands. They start by asking for housing in Haifa, and then they find out later that the money have been spent in building settlements in Nablus. They ask for more health care in Tel Aviv, and then they find that the money is spent on the occupation. If Israel was to stop settlement policy, it will have more money to spend it on housing in Israel proper, which we recognize, and we still recognize on the border of 1967. So that, in short, is what we think the regional implications will be. It's going to take time, obviously. Egypt is going to take time to stabilize in the new system, more democratic, freer, more social justice, but also more dignity and more ability in the international arena, and more ability to deal with Israel in peace, to get out of Israel what Israel should have delivered in accordance with the agreement in 1979. I think the Arab Spring will prevail in the Arab world, as the Spring prevailed in Eastern Europe 20 years ago, as the democratic Spring came into Latin America 15 years ago. Westerners sometimes forget that there have been Western societies under dictatorships for years. And then there comes a time when the spring comes in Brazil, in Argentina, in Uruguay, in Hungary, in Poland. And this spring is coming into the Arab world. And it will take time, Mr. Elliott. Don't expect the economy will shape up tomorrow. Don't expect that everything will be settled. But we have all the trust in the Egyptian people and the 7,000 years of history that brings them stability, wisdom, and ability. And I think that's a strength for Palestine in its attempt to negotiate a proper agreement, reaching a real peace, despite all the imbalance of power that exists. Thank you very much.
I was asked 3 questions as regards breaking the overall question of the regional impact into specifics. Is there a role for international guarantees or American guarantees in this transition phase? Will the Palestinian bid complicate the prospects for peace? I'm shortening a very long question. And is there a danger of war? My answers, to be very quick, are no, yes, and no, but. No, I do not believe that under the circumstances now unfolding, with a very dramatic set of developments of extreme uncertainty as to consequences, that international guarantees can be in any way relevant. Moreover, I do fear that the question of whether the United States can actually help stabilize this dynamic situation is the cause of much of what we are seeing. I'll be very frank, Dr. Schaas, forgive me if I put a slightly different spin on what I think was the Palestinian reaction to what happened to President Mubarak. I can make the case for the manner in which the West and the United States specifically dealt with the Egyptian crisis, but it doesn't alter the fact that this was a painful shock to many in the region and to the Palestinian leadership. And I think this bid to go to the United Nations reflects pique and frustration over this development as much as anything else. And I think I know why I say so. Moreover, we've had now a question of whether or not international guarantees can be effective. Let me go back in time a bit. In 2006, we had in Israel a government, not this government, which was truly the nearest we ever had to a multilateralist leadership, very much attuned to European concerns, and it opted at the end of the war in Lebanon, which was imposed on us by Hezbollah, for an internationally mandated solution underwritten by European commitment to enhance its presence in southern Lebanon under UNIFIL, and written into a UN Security Council resolution in 1701. And so right away, it was my feeling back then that this is an ultimate test for the future of Israeli capacity to rely on international guarantees. Unfortunately, the verdict is in, and it is mathematical. There were 15,000 rockets aimed at Israeli citizens, hidden under villages and within civilian populations, which, if I may remind all of us, is a crime against humanity as defined by the Statute of Rome. There were 15,000 of these back then. There are 40,000 now. And much the same has happened in Gaza. So our capacity and our willingness, I'll come back to it later this afternoon when we discuss the larger security question, our capacity to rely on international guarantees has been diminished by experience, not by theory. Will the Palestinian bid complicate matters? Yes, unfortunately, it will. And I am afraid I cannot take your promise, Dr. Schaas, at face value when it comes to the legalization of the process, for the simple reason that this is, as already mentioned here, made explicit by President Abbas in his problematic essay on the 17th of May in the New York Times. I say problematic because it also had a version of history of 1947 and 48 that, to me, spoke to a total disregard towards Israeli memories and sensibilities. But leave that aside. And perhaps to answer to Congressman Wexler's passionate case about the Israeli-American disagreement, I would remind all of us again that no one, either in the United States or in other Western capitals, rose to dispute openly with Abu Mazen that misrepresentation of history. But let's go back to the question of legalization of the process. And just let's allow me to say that some of what we've heard here should be taken, as they say in good Latin, cum grano salis, with a grain of salt. For example, is the blockade of Gaza illegal, as you've just said? No, it is not. And this was the opinion just delivered by the supreme authority on the law of the sea, who happens to have been also the Prime Minister of New Zealand, but his reputation rests, I think, more on the former than on the latter. And what we had in response from the Turkish government is a childish stomp on a verdict delivered by professionals. So what is the point of legalization, the exercise? I don't know. Can it do damage? Yes. Why? Because the settlement question is indeed central. But let us be practical and look down towards the future. It's the only way to solve it is in a way which is legitimate in the eyes of the majority of Israelis, I would even dare say a good number of settlers, is painful in a way which may even make 2005 look like a school excursion, but it has to flow not from some outside verdict, but from a negotiated agreement that enjoys the support of the majority of Israelis. It is not impossible. What is impossible, indeed, is the external imposition of an outcome. And that was the problem with the settlement freeze to begin with. Instead of facilitating such a debate, what it did is lump together every Jewish person who happens to live beyond the accidental lines of 1967 and drive them all into one political camp. A mistake that needs not be repeated. Now, I would not make the case, I would not dare make the case, if Dr. Scharf was right and what Israel is doing is making the future Palestinian state vanish in a burst of settlement construction. But I challenge you to give me the name of one new settlement in the last few years. One. I'm not talking about added housings within, this should have been and was what was called the Paris-Powell understandings, that there will be no increase in the footprint of the existing settlement. And this is a position that Prime Minister Netanyahu committed to in his first days in office at the Bar Ilan speech.
Go together to the outposts around
the outposts are illegal, and as you know, 3 houses in an outpost were just demolished on the heads of literally the families driven out in the middle of the night by the Israeli army, Jewish families, and the houses demolished. So I do not need a lecture on that question. But the activity of creating settlements has ceased, and moreover, the money spent by the government, not by individuals buying houses and increase or building homes for their families, but by the government, is minuscule and utterly irrelevant to the social questions that you've mentioned. But at the end of the day, we have to come to the table and we have to create the basis for reconciliation. It has to be based on the recognition that there is such a thing as a Jewish people with ancient historical claims to the same land that the Palestinians claim. This is why I will take the term red Indianization has been mentioned here. Let me say something here to people whose position is that we are ultimately a colonialist invasion. We have come back to a land which is ours as much as it is the Palestinians' land. And to deny this is not to do a disservice to us. We have lived with insults and denials for 3,000 years. It is to do a disservice to the capacity of the Palestinian side to come to terms with the fact that they've been fighting a legitimate national movement. And any maneuver, like the ones we've seen on the terms of reference recently and in the previous discussion, any maneuver away from this is a disservice to the future of the Palestinian people. Finally, will there be war? I don't think so. There will be serious problems, however. Even if we decide to try and be of help, I'm not sure we can stop the US Congress from suspending aid. Certainly, we cannot do so if the reconciliation agreement goes through. I urge you to read the American legislation on this subject. It does not leave any room for maneuver. A government in which Hamas, being what it is, governed by the document that governs it, and I urge you to read it, cannot be supported by the people of the United States through their elected representatives, and there will be nothing we can do about it. Will there be tensions? Yes, I think the Palestinian response, the Palestinian leadership's response to the horrific attack near Eilat demolished much of the faith and hope that we had in the possibility of managing the relationship at the highest level. But on the ground, I believe that things can hold. Mr. Abu Sidu earlier mentioned the marches in Syria. Well, actually, my point exactly. It was so obvious to everyone in the region that this was a transparent maneuver by the Rami Makhloufs of this world and his cousin, as he promised us, to create trouble on our borders because the Syrian regime is in trouble. It was so transparent that the aggrieved participants came back to Yarmouk camp and attacked the headquarters of Ahmed Jibril, whereupon they fired on them. Now, if I sat with our PSYOP experts for a year, I would not have invented a scenario as obviously, I would say, detrimental to this idea of organized marches as this actually was, and I should expect that the lessons have been learned on both sides. I can assure you that from within government, that the IDF will do everything humanly possible to prevent whatever happens from deteriorating into conflict. It is, if I may say so, preposterous to suggest that we are looking for pretexts. In fact, the very idea that Israel is looking to undermine the prospects of a Palestinian state is given the lie by the fact that this government of all governments has done more than anyone before it to facilitate capacity building and the bottom-up process in which Tony Blair and others have been so supportive. And the fact that the Fayyad plan is proceeding with some obvious lacuna, there is somehow no provision for Palestinian currency, because I think even Fayyad does not presume to think that the Palestinian economy is ready to sustain itself. But the fact that it is proceeding is very much because of Israeli policy. And in Gaza, well, contrary perhaps to an impression created here, I don't know, this is not my numbers. These are the Palestinian Bureau of Statistics numbers for the first quarter of 2011. The Gaza economy grew at 24.2%. That's pipe dream for most of the world, not to mention Europe nowadays. 24.2%. So obviously, whatever Israel is doing and making possible is certainly not the starvation of the Palestinian people in Gaza.
It's all thanks to the tunnels?
No, absolutely not. There is now no item that can go into Gaza that does not go into Gaza with permission, except what can be used to build bunkers or rockets.
Which is all the building materials. Steel
and concrete. True, because we know, yes, we do know what use Hamas makes of them. You cannot ask the Israeli government to facilitate the murder of its own citizens. That you will agree is something that no government can accept. But to argue that Israel is looking for pretexts to undermine the prospect of a Palestinian state, I think is deeply and systematically contradicted by our actions in the last few years.
The assumption has been that if the United Nations does recognize the statehood of Palestine, that somehow is a victory for the Palestinian point of view and a defeat for Israel. How would you respond to the suggestion that has been made that it might also be a great defeat for Hamas, because it will be a recognition based on the 67 boundaries, two-state solution, which Hamas was created or exists to basically oppose? Nabil first.
Well, up till the reconciliation, that would have been true, but the reconciliation agreement included three very important elements that many people just want to ignore. One, a commitment by Hamas to non-violence and to stop all violent action across the border. And in fact, the very unfortunate Eilat incident, Israel never accused Hamas of doing them, and never in fact made a clear statement about who it is it blames, but certainly not Hamas. Hamas has tried its best to commit to what it calls hudna, which is a non-violence, which is a stop to all violent activities. Two, Hamas for the first time made it clear publicly by Khalid Mish'al in the meeting its commitment to the two-state approach, to a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza on the border of 1967. And three, Hamas accepted that if Mahmoud Abbas finds it relevant, possible to go back to negotiations, that he can go back to negotiations. Said, Abu Mazen, you have been negotiating for 18 years, and if you think that there's still a chance, we don't mind spending more years trying to get a solution. So Hamas is changing also. And its change came also, I think, part of that Arab Spring we talked about. It came as a result of this reconciliation agreement we signed. It's true that that reconciliation agreement has not been fully implemented yet, but the three major political aspects of it that has to do with Israel have been done. And I think maybe Mr. Iran will tell us that there has been every effort by Hamas not to make any violent escalation with Israel.
Yaret. Yaret, I said in Arabic. But
up till now?
No, it's not accurate, entirely accurate. Let me say.
How accurate? 90%?
It's partly accurate, but yes, Hamas has. Let me say a couple of words, because I think we all read the same sheet of music as to Hamas's predicament. They are in serious trouble. They have been an Iranian ally, not a proxy. I used to say that the difference between Palestinian Islamic Jihad, for example, and Hamas is literally a different proposition. PIJ, like Hezbollah, works for the Iranians. Hamas works with the Iranians. However, Iran is now implicated in the repression of the Syrian people, including the Muslim Brotherhood, in Syria. The Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas being, by its own definition, the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. So they are definitely in a squeeze due to the Syrian situation, and we do understand that this is part of the dynamic that drove their attempt at reconciliation, but only halfway, because at the end of the day, there are still the three quartet conditions. They are simple, straightforward, and universally endorsed by the United Nations, Russia, the EU, as well as the United States. Hamas could have easily accepted them, but didn't. And so there is still a long way to go between the murky language of the reconciliation agreement and the fairly straightforward proposition. And by the way, it is the position of the government of Israel that if Hamas accepts these three conditions, we shall forget what they've done. We didn't even ask them specifically to go through the real or fake convulsions of changing their covenant. But we shall accept them as part of the Palestinian legitimate negotiating partner, but not until they do so. This is not an Israeli position. It is a very broad international position. Hamas is a terrorist organization, not on our lists alone, and there is reason for that. Moreover, I wish it was true that they have actually truly and finally committed to nonviolence. First of all, the relationship between the popular committees that carried out the atrocity. And by the way, I remind all of us, this is not about an Israeli bus with soldiers. This is about two cars with middle-aged couples, 4 in one, 2 in other, taken out, shot and slaughtered, with one woman surviving because she pretended to be dead. Now, in our experience, when such a thing happens, there are certain shivers that go down our spine, and I have to tell you that the response of the Palestinian Authority to this atrocity fell well short of what it should have been. But in any case, the popular committees have a murky relationship with Hamas. One example, we all know that they are the ones who abducted our soldier, Gilad Shalit, but it is Hamas which is holding him. Now, how did that happen? So please, I have to say, I need to be persuaded that there is no link between Mr. Jabari and the popular committees. Moreover, Hamas has tried to carry out terrorist attacks elsewhere. I cannot give details. Just recently, enough said, one very major attack has been prevented just recently. So let us not assume that Hamas has desisted.
Any reconciliation agreement, such as the one between Hamas and Fatah, holds some promise and some dangers. The promise, of course, is that Hamas will actually change. The danger is that the people in Fatah and the PA become apologists for Hamas and its continued engagement in terrorism. And what is saddening, I think, is that we have just seen that happen, because Dr. South has been here telling us, oh, Hamas has changed in this way and that, and you see they really don't believe in terrorism anymore. Of course, not one word of their vile charter has been changed. That was the danger, and it is very unfortunate that it is, in fact, happening now. It is eventuating because it makes peace a great deal further away. The European Union, Russia, the UN, and the US in the Quartet did set forth those conditions as preconditions for our collective support for peace, because none of those named would ask Israel to make peace with Hamas unless it changed. And now what we're hearing is, don't worry about that. But that is an obfuscation of the facts about Hamas, and it doesn't bring peace closer.